On September 10, 2025, federal agents in 3 cities moved at the same hour. In Manhattan, a grand jury's indictment was unsealed. In East Los Angeles, a 79-year-old woman was arrested at her home, and beneath a bedroom floor, investigators found a trap door. Under that floor, approximately $220,000 in cash, gold coins, jewelry, and a jade-wrapped USB drive. What is on that drive has not yet been revealed in open court. But the indictment says it connects 3 generations of leadership inside one of the largest religious institutions in the Western Hemisphere. This is La Luz del Mundo, in English, the light of the world. 5 million claimed members, 15,000 temples, 58 countries on 5 continents. And at its center, for the last decade, a man who called himself the Apostle of Jesus Christ. Naasón Joaquín García. In Mexico, Garcia was not a fringe figure. He met with sitting presidents. He commanded the loyalty of a constituency that no political party in Mexico could afford to ignore. When Garcia's father, Samuel Joaquín Flores, died in 2014, an estimated 600,000 people filled the streets of Guadalajara for the funeral procession. The scale of mourning was without precedent for a religious leader in modern Mexico. Naasón inherited that title and that following in 2014. The dynastic succession gave the enterprise 98 years of unbroken institutional cover, stretching back to 1926. In the United States, the church's North American base sits in East Los Angeles, a gleaming facility on a neighborhood block, indistinguishable at first glance from any other major evangelical campus. Garcia appeared on Spanish-language television. He was received by governors and senators. His church's own figures claimed 15,000 temples across more than 50 countries. This was not a cult in a compound. This was a transnational religious institution with tax-exempt status on both sides of the border and the political connections to match. But something else had been building inside it for nearly a century. To understand how this was possible, how it endured for 3 generations, you have to understand the doctrine, not the hymns, the architecture. La Luz del Mundo was founded in 1926 by Eusebio Joaquín González, who took the name Aarón, a deliberate biblical invocation. The founding theology was restorationist. God had chosen this man and this bloodline to restore the true apostolic church on earth. From that founding claim flows everything else. If God personally chose the apostle, if this man is the living voice of God on earth, then his word is not a suggestion. It is doctrine, it is divine law. And if the apostle's word is divine law, then refusal of any demand he makes is not just disobedience, it is sin. It is grounds for eternal damnation. Researchers who study high-control religious groups call this pattern apostolic inerrancy, the doctrine that the living leader cannot err, cannot sin, and therefore cannot be questioned. It is the theological foundation on which abuse becomes invisible. But LLDM's control system was not only theological. Researchers used the BITE model to describe what happens inside organizations like this: behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control, all 4 operating simultaneously. Behavior control: members were told how to dress, who they could marry, and where they could go. Women in particular operated under strict codes: movement, appearance, association, all regulated by church authority. Information control: outside media was discouraged. Contact with ex-members was forbidden. Defectors were shunned, cut off from family, from friends, from the only community they had ever known. Thought control: the leader's interpretation of Scripture was the only permitted interpretation. To doubt his teaching was framed as spiritual rebellion, the first step toward damnation. And emotional control, the most effective lever, belonging, salvation, and family, were all conditional on obedience. Every relationship a member had was mediated through the institution. To leave was to lose everything. Layered onto this doctrine was a specific structural category the federal prosecution would later name, what the indictment describes as an unconditional servant class. Women and girls designated for lifelong, exclusive personal service to the apostle. These women and girls were told, according to prosecutors, that their bodies, their minds, and their souls belonged to the apostle, that service to him was indistinguishable from service to God. Sochil Martin was born into a fourth-generation LLDM family in 1986. She has testified that she was given over to Samuel Joaquin Flores as a personal servant at age 9. In her own words, at a press conference in 2022, quote, "For the first 30 years of my life, I was taught to believe that my body, my mind, my soul belonged to La Luz del Mundo." She would later estimate she provided approximately 30,000 hours of unpaid labor over the course of her membership. That is more than 14 years of continuous 40-hour work weeks. The financial extraction was just as structural. The church required a mandatory 10% tithe from every member's income. But that was not the ceiling. Civil lawsuit filings detail additional mandatory weekly offerings, income percentages on windfalls like loans and settlements, and personal donations directed specifically to the apostle's household, not to a general institutional fund. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division would later note that Naasón used donations to fund, quote, expensive cars, jewelry, clothing, luxury vacations, and private jet charters. The tithes of the faithful became the apostle's personal expense account. Members also donated tens of thousands of hours of construction labor to build the church's temples, framed not as work, but as an act of devotion. The honor of serving the apostle was the only compensation offered. This is the machine, a theological claim to divine authority at the top, financial extraction flowing upward, unpaid labor flowing upward, and for the women and girls designated for personal service, their bodies, according to prosecutors, flowing upward too. And when anyone inside that machine tried to speak, the institution had a dedicated apparatus to silence them. That apparatus would eventually be named explicitly in a federal indictment. But first, the receipts. There are 7 receipts in this case. Let's pull them one by one. Receipt 1, June 3, 2019. Naasón Joaquín García, age 49, is arrested by California DOJ agents at Los Angeles International Airport as he deplanes from a private jet. The California DOJ filed 23 felony counts against him, including forcible assault of a minor, human trafficking, and the production of criminal imagery involving minors. The judge set bail at $90 million. At the time, prosecutors described it as the highest bail amount in California history. The church responded immediately. Thousands of members staged vigils outside the jail. Church leadership maintained that the apostle was innocent, that evidence had been fabricated, and that he would be vindicated. That's Receipt 1. Receipt 2, February 13, 2020. A woman named Sochil Martin, a fourth-generation LLDM member and survivor, filed the first federal civil lawsuit against the church in Los Angeles. The complaint, filed by Greenberg Gross LLP and Jeff Anderson and Associates, invoked the RICO statute, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the same law used against the mob. The suit alleged forced labor, money laundering, systematic sexual abuse across generations, and financial extraction totaling in the millions. Martin was not alone. She was the first to put it in federal court. Martin would later say, quote, "For nearly 22 years I was made to work for, travel for, lie for, and give my body to an organization that saw me as nothing more than a source of profit and sexual pleasure." She added, "Hundreds, if not thousands of other children before me and after me suffered the same fate." Receipt 3, June 3, 2022. 3 years after his arrest, Naasón Joaquín García walked into Los Angeles Superior Court and entered a guilty plea. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of forcible oral copulation involving minors and 1 count of a lewd act upon a child who was 15 years old. In exchange, prosecutors dropped 16 additional counts. Those counts included allegations of assault of children and women and human trafficking for the production of criminal imagery involving minors. The victims were not consulted on the deal. Multiple survivors publicly objected. The church issued a formal statement the same day. It read, quote, "The apostle of Jesus Christ has had no choice but to accept with much pain that the agreement presented is the best way forward to protect the church and his family." To protect the church and his family. Not to acknowledge the harm, not to name the victims, to protect the institution. Receipt 4, June 8, 2022. 5 days after the plea, Judge Ronald Coen sentenced Garcia to 16 years and 8 months in state prison with lifetime sex offender registration. Judge Coen called Garcia, quote, "a sexual predator." He then addressed the family members who had abandoned the victims in the courtroom. The judge said, and I'm reading directly from the court record, quote, "For those family members that have abandoned you, shame, shame on you." At the same hearing, a victim who identified herself as a niece of Garcia read a statement. She said, quote, "I worshipped my abuser. He used me over and over again like a sacrificial lamb taken to slaughter." That statement was delivered inside a court of law. The church was still holding vigils outside. Receipt 5. October 26, 2023. A federal grand jury in Los Angeles issued a separate indictment, charging Garcia with producing and possessing criminal imagery involving a minor. Prosecutors confirmed they had withheld the federal charge until the state case concluded. The evidence, an iPad, seized at the time of his 2019 arrest, containing 5 videos depicting a 16-year-old church follower. The device had been in federal custody for 4 years before the charge was filed. That's receipt 5 of 7. 2 left, and they are the worst. Receipt 6. September 10th, 2025. The Southern District of New York unseals a superseding federal indictment, charging 6 defendants under RICO, sex trafficking, and child exploitation statutes. Garcia is transferred from Chino State Prison into federal custody. His 79-year-old mother, Eva Garcia de Joaquin, is arrested at her home in East Los Angeles at the same hour. When agents searched her home, they executed a warrant on 2 adjoining Garcia family properties. In total, prosecutors say they seized well over $1 million in U.S. currency, along with foreign cash, gold coins, pure gold and platinum pieces, luxury watches, and jewelry. And in a bedroom, under a bed, they found a trap door. Below it, a concealed underground safe containing approximately $220,000 in cash, gold coins, jewelry, and, according to the detention memo, a jade-wrapped USB drive. Federal prosecutors also moved to seize 4 properties, 3 homes in Los Angeles and 1 rural property in San Bernardino County. The indictment named the properties as proceeds of the alleged criminal enterprise. U.S. Attorney Jay Clayton of the Southern District of New York made a statement at the time of the unsealing. I want to read it exactly as he said it. Quote, "They exploited the faith of their followers to prey upon them. When they were confronted, they leveraged their religious influence and financial power to intimidate and coerce victims into remaining silent about the abuse they had suffered." End quote. IRS Criminal Investigations Special Agent in Charge Harry T. Chavis Jr. added this, quote, "Behind the legitimacy of a church and their many believing congregants, Naasón and his co-conspirators built an alleged criminal empire on the abuse of women and children." End quote. Now, Receipt 7. This is the one that has not yet been fully adjudicated in any court, but it is in the indictment, under oath, filed in the Southern District of New York. The federal indictment alleges that the enterprise's abuse did not begin with Naasón. It alleges it began with his father, Samuel. and that it was, according to prosecutors, operated for the sexual gratification of Naasón and his father. And the indictment contains one specific allegation about Samuel's wife, Naasón's mother, Eva García de Joaquín. According to the indictment, on at least one occasion, Eva García de Joaquín, quote, held down a minor victim so that Samuel could assault the victim. These are allegations. The indictment has been filed. No verdict has been returned. But federal prosecutors, in writing in a court of law, have put that claim on the record. Garcia's defense attorney, Alan Jackson, responded publicly. He said, quote, "We categorically deny these charges. We reject the grotesque portrait painted by the government and its allies." Jackson also said the charges were, quote, "a rehashing of old, recycled claims that have been made before, scrutinized before, and ultimately debunked and disproven before." Garcia pleaded not guilty on September 23, 2025, before Judge Loretta Presca in Manhattan. 7 receipts, a 2019 arrest, a 2020 civil RICO suit, a 2022 guilty plea with 16 counts dropped, a sentencing, a 2023 federal exploitation charge, a 2025 RICO indictment, and a federal allegation about what happened inside a family home. But here's the thing about the receipts in this case. Every single one of them was preceded by warning signs that were documented, reported, and ignored. Let's look at the cracks. The first thing to understand about LLDM's silencing operation is that it was not improvised. It was structural. It had dedicated personnel, and it had been running for years before any arrest was made. The 2025 federal indictment names Joram Núñez Joaquín, a Naasón family relative and law school graduate, as a defendant. His alleged role: posing as a practicing attorney to silence victims and witnesses, and destroying evidence. He was arrested outside Chicago on September 10, 2025. The indictment alleges he did not simply pressure victims informally. He impersonated a licensed attorney, using the credibility of the legal profession as a coercion tool. Also named in the indictment, Sailem Garcia Peña, age 43, the head of public relations for Naasón and the LLDM Church. His alleged role: using the church's official PR apparatus to prevent abuse victims from reporting to law enforcement. Garcia Peña is believed to be at large in Mexico as of the indictment's unsealing. The PR director is, according to prosecutors, the institution's official silencer, operating under the church's own letterhead. Also indicted but believed to be at large in Mexico, Rosa Sosa, 59, and Azalia Rangel Garcia, 46. Prosecutors allege they served as groomers, identifying and preparing minors and young women for abuse by Naasón and Samuel. Rangel Garcia was previously named in the California state charges filed in 2019. She became a fugitive that same year. The church continued to operate. No institutional disruption was triggered by her disappearance. The indictment also contains a detail that prosecutors described as integral to the abuse cycle itself: alleged use of cleaning supplies. Agents allege that evidence was destroyed during and after abusive encounters, operationally embedded in the abuse itself, not an afterthought. Then there is the question of political protection. Anthropologist Elio Masferrer, who has studied LLDM for decades, documented the church's deep entanglement with Mexican political parties. Masferrer documented, quote, connections so close that political entities were known to interfere with judicial processes. He wrote, if the political power said that accusations should not go through a judicial process, then no action was taken. This was not hidden. Masferrer's research was published. Academic credentialed analysts named it. The complaints were documented, and for decades, the institution absorbed the pressure without consequence. And when survivors did speak, when Sochil Martin filed that federal lawsuit in 2020 with RICO language, The church's response was to deploy its PR infrastructure to frame her as a disgruntled apostate with financial motives. Martin described it directly, quote, "It is the mafia. That's what it is." She said that to NPR in September 2025, responding to the new federal indictment. She had been saying some version of it since 2020. NBC Los Angeles had reported that prosecutors in the California case specifically accused Garcia of using his spiritual authority to tell girls and young women that complying with his demands would lead to salvation, and that refusal would lead to damnation. That was the crack that was always visible, a theology that could be weaponized to justify any demand, and an institution that had, for 3 generations, made sure no one outside could see clearly enough to act. But here is what makes this story more than the story of one family and one church. The mechanism the Joaquín family used, every layer of it, has appeared before. In other organizations, in other states, with different names. Let me show you 3. First, NXIVM, a self-improvement organization based in Albany, New York, led by a man named Keith Raniere. Raniere claimed a quasi-divine intellectual authority. He called himself the smartest man in the world and framed his teachings as a path to personal liberation. His inner circle operated a program called DOS, a tiered system of women who served male masters above them. DOS is directly analogous to LLDM's unconditional servant class. Both programs required women and girls to render personal service, physical, sexual, and domestic, to the man at the top, framed as spiritual advancement. Like LLDM, NXIVM used forced labor and financial extraction. Like LLDM, it deployed a dedicated legal and communications apparatus to silence and discredit survivors who tried to leave or report. In 2019, Raniere was convicted on all counts in the Eastern District of New York, including racketeering, sex trafficking, and forced labor. In 2020, he was sentenced to 120 years in federal prison. 120 years is the federal RICO sentencing ceiling the Joaquín case now has as a reference point. That number will matter when the SDNY case concludes. The second parallel, Warren Jeffs and the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the FLDS. A dynastic patriarchal sect operating across Utah, Arizona, and Texas. Jeffs claimed exclusive divine authority, that his word as prophet was the word of God. He used that authority to arrange the abuse of minors across generations, enforce total community control, and punish defectors with ostracism. Like LLDM, the FLDS enterprise spanned multiple states. Like LLDM, it required absolute obedience framed as theology. And like LLDM, it took decades to prosecute, because victims feared excommunication more than they trusted law enforcement to protect them. Jeffs was convicted in 2011 and sentenced to life in prison plus 20 years. The communities he controlled still exist today. The doctrine survived the prosecution of the man. What connects all 3 cases, LLDM, NXIVM, FLDS, is not just the abuse. It is the architecture that made the abuse invisible, survivable for the institution, and nearly unprosecutable for years. Single bloodline authority concentration, mandatory financial extraction, information control enforced by an insider threat, and transnational geography that exploits gaps in cross-border law enforcement. Every element present in all 3. And in each case, the tool that finally reached the system, rather than just the individual, was the same. The RICO statute, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, originally designed to dismantle organized crime families. Because when abuse is isolated, one incident, one perpetrator, a prosecutor charges one crime. But when the institution itself is the instrument, when the tithing, the doctrine, the PR team, and the fake lawyer all serve the same criminal purpose, RICO is what names it. The pattern is not a coincidence, it is a playbook. And it worked, repeatedly,
until federal prosecutors stopped prosecuting the players and started prosecuting the game.
So, where does this case stand now? Let me be honest about that, because this is where documentary films often offer false comfort. They don't here. Naasón Joaquín García is currently in federal custody in the Southern District of New York. On September 23, 2025, he appeared before Judge Loretta Preska in Manhattan and pleaded not guilty to all counts. At that hearing, Assistant U.S. Attorney Elizabeth Espinoza told the court there was, quote, an enormous amount of electronic evidence in the case. Garcia's next hearing was set for December 15th. His state sentence, 16 years and 8 months, currently runs in parallel. Whether the federal case will result in additional time or concurrent time has not yet been determined by the court. Eva Garcia de Joaquin, 79 years old, was arrested on September 10th. The detention memo from prosecutors, according to reporting by NPR and LAist, opposed bail on the grounds that she posed a serious flight risk. 3 defendants, Garcia Peña, Rosa Sosa, and Azalia Rangel Garcia, remain at large in Mexico. Extradition from Mexico is a lengthy, uncertain legal process. As of this recording, no extradition proceedings have been publicly confirmed. Meanwhile, La Luz del Mundo itself continues to operate. The church has not been dissolved. Its tax-exempt status has not been revoked. Its 15,000 temples remain open. 5 million people who joined this church in good faith, who believed, who gave, who built, are still members of an institution whose leader is in federal custody and whose founding doctrine has been named in a federal indictment as the mechanism of abuse. And then there is the detail that NPR reported from the prosecutor's detention memo, the one that stops you cold. Quote, in many cases, girls and women abused by one leader remained in the church and became the mothers of the next leader's victims. Let that land as a structural fact, not a rhetorical device. It means the enterprise replicated itself through the people it had already harmed. Generation after generation, the supply of victims was internally produced. The California conviction stands. The federal case proceeds. The survivor's civil lawsuit continues. But the institution that produced 3 generations of alleged abuse has no legal obligation today to change its doctrine. The reckoning, in other words, is incomplete. The man is charged. The mother is arrested. The machine is still running. That is the honest account of where this case stands in late 2025. But it leaves a question this channel exists to answer. Not for the courts, but for anyone watching who attends a religious community. What does this look like before a federal indictment? Five things. 5 specific signals this case put on the record. Watch for any one of them in your own community. 1. Apostolic inerrancy used as abuse cover. Any doctrine that declares a living leader to be the direct voice of God, making their words and demands literally beyond question, creates a framework where victims cannot even name what is happening to them as harm. Watch for the teaching framed as, to doubt the leader is to doubt God. That is not a theological position. That is an access control mechanism. 2. Mandatory multi-layer financial extraction flowing to the leader's personal household. Standard tithing is not itself a warning sign, but watch for financial contributions that flow specifically to the leader's personal account, not to a transparent institutional fund. 3. Unpaid labor framed as devotion. When a community routinely donates labor, building, cleaning, personal errands, travel, with no records, no compensation, and no right to refuse, that is forced labor with a theological costume. 4. An insider legal or PR apparatus whose primary function is discrediting accusers, not pursuing justice. When the institution's response to a survivor speaking publicly is to call them a disgruntled apostate with financial motives, rather than to investigate the claim, that institution is not managing a controversy, it is obstructing one. And 5. The most important structural marker this case produced: generational capture. When survivors cannot leave and their children become the next generation of victims, the institution has become a closed loop of harm. Exit pathways matter. Social support outside the community, educational independence, financial resources not controlled by leadership. The presence of those pathways, or the deliberate removal of them, tells you more about an institution than its theology. La Luz del Mundo has existed for nearly 100 years. The SDNY indictment charges that its leadership used nearly all of those years to build and protect a criminal enterprise. That case is now in federal court. And here is the question I'll leave you with, because this niche argues about it, and it should. The tax exemption that shields organizations like La Luz del Mundo has stood largely unchanged since 1954. It requires no financial disclosure, no audited accounts, and no demonstrated accountability to anyone outside the institution. Given what 3 federal cases now document, should religious organizations that refuse to open their financial books to independent oversight retain that exemption? Tell me in the comments.